Picture this, a locked vault in a government archive. Inside, yellowed pages filled with handwriting that hasn't been fully shared with the world in over 80 years. These pages belong to someone who witnessed the final collapse of one of history's darkest chapters from the most intimate vantage point imaginable. Her name was Eva Braun, and her personal diaries remain one of the most controversial and restricted historical documents of the 20th century. Why? What could be written in those pages that governments, historians, and archivists have deemed too sensitive to release in full? And what does this silence tell us about how we remember and forget the past? Today, we're going to explore one of World War II's most enduring mysteries. Not the mystery of military strategy or political conspiracy, but something far more unsettling. The hidden thoughts of a woman who chose to remain by the side of Adolf Hitler until the very end. A woman whose voice has been filtered, edited, and controlled by others for generations. A woman whose diary might hold answers we're not ready to hear. This is the story of Eva Braun's secret diary and why the world may never read it in full. To understand why Eva Braun's diary matters, we first need to understand Eva Braun herself. And that's where the story gets complicated, because history has never quite known what to do with her. Born on February 6, 1912 in Munich, Germany, Eva Anna Paula Braun grew up in a middle-class Catholic family. Her father was a schoolteacher. Her mother raised Eva and her two sisters in a household that valued modesty, education, and traditional German values. There was nothing in Eva's early life that suggested she would become one of the most recognized and reviled women of the 20th century. She was, by all accounts, ordinary. She loved dancing, skiing, and gymnastics. She dreamed of becoming an actress or a dancer, though her parents discouraged such ambitions. At 17, she took a job as an assistant and model at the photography studio of Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer. It was there, in October 1929, that Eva Braun met Adolf Hitler for the first time. She was 17. He was 40. The encounter was unremarkable at first. Hoffmann introduced them casually. Hitler was polite, distant, already consumed by his political ambitions. But something about Eva caught his attention. Or perhaps it was simply that she showed interest in him at a time when he craved validation. Whatever the reason, they began a secret relationship that would last 16 years, ending only with their deaths in a Berlin bunker in April 1945. What's crucial to understand is this. Eva Braun lived almost her entire adult life in Hitler's shadow, yet she remained deliberately hidden from the German public. Hitler wanted to maintain the image of a leader married only to Germany, a man of singular purpose. Eva was kept secret, isolated, and often ignored. She spent years waiting in mountain retreats and private residences, forbidden from appearing in public, forbidden from being acknowledged. And in that isolation, she began to write. The exact timeline of when Eva Braun started keeping a diary is disputed among historians. What we know for certain is that she maintained personal journals and wrote extensive entries during key periods of her life, particularly during the early years of her relationship with Hitler. The most well-known fragment of her diary covers the years 1935 to 1937, a period when Eva was in her early 20s, deeply infatuated with Hitler and profoundly lonely. These entries, which were recovered after the war and partially published, reveal a woman desperate for attention, validation, and love from a man who was emotionally unavailable. In one entry from February 1935, she writes about her frustration with Hitler's neglect, describing how he rarely visits her and seems indifferent to her emotional needs. She contemplates ending her life, writing with heartbreaking clarity about her feelings of worthlessness. In another entry, she describes attempting suicide by shooting herself in the chest, a suicide attempt that failed, but which seemed to finally get Hitler's attention. These diary fragments paint a portrait of a young woman trapped in a deeply dysfunctional relationship with a man who would become synonymous with evil. But here's what makes this so compelling. These fragments are only a small portion of what Eva Braun wrote. According to multiple sources who encountered her during the war years, Eva continued to write regularly, documenting her life, her thoughts, and her observations of the inner circle of the regime. So where are those later entries? What happened to the diaries she kept during the war itself, during the years when she was living at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, surrounded by the most powerful and dangerous men in Europe? What did she write about the conversation she overheard, the decisions being made, the reality of the regime's crimes? That's where the trail goes cold, and where the classification begins. When the war ended in May 1945, the Allied forces began the massive task of recovering, cataloging, and analyzing millions of documents left behind by the collapsed regime. Among these were personal papers, letters, photographs, and diaries belonging to high-ranking officials and their associates. Eva Braun's belongings were scattered across multiple locations. Some were found in the ruins of the Berghof, which had been bombed by the Royal Air Force in the final weeks of the war. Others were recovered from the bunker in Berlin, where Eva and Hitler spent their final days. Still more materials were seized from storage facilities and private homes belonging to members of Hitler's inner circle. What happened next is where history becomes murky. According to declassified intelligence reports, American and British forces recovered several volumes of Eva Braun's personal writings. These were initially classified as intelligence materials and transferred to military archives. Some portions were translated and analyzed by intelligence officers looking for any information that might be relevant to ongoing war crimes, investigations, or denazification efforts. But here's the critical question. Why weren't these diaries simply released to the public or turned over to historians once their intelligence value had been assessed? Why, 8 decades later, do significant portions of Eva Braun's writings remain restricted, locked away in government archives with access granted only under special circumstances? The answer, according to archivists and historians who have studied this issue, is multifaceted and deeply troubling. Let's start with the most obvious explanation: protection of privacy and dignity of living individuals. When Eva Braun wrote her diaries, she wasn't writing for publication. She was writing private thoughts, personal observations, and candid assessments of the people around her. Many of the individuals she wrote about, high-ranking officials, military officers, their spouses and families, survived the war. In the years immediately following 1945, there were legitimate legal concerns about releasing materials that could defame or harm living people, even if those people had been part of a criminal regime. As decades passed and those individuals died, this justification became less compelling. But it didn't disappear entirely. The descendants of those mentioned in Eva's diaries, many of whom have spent their entire lives trying to distance themselves from their family histories, have legal standing to object to the publication of materials that might implicate or embarrass their relatives. But privacy concerns alone don't explain the continued classification. There's something else going on. Something that suggests the content of these diaries is more problematic than mere gossip or personal observation. The second theory is darker and more complex: that Eva Braun's diaries contain information that contradicts or complicates the official historical narrative of the regime and its leadership. Now, let me be absolutely clear about what I mean by this. I'm not suggesting that Eva's diaries contain anything that would exonerate, justify, or diminish the crimes committed during this period. The historical record of those crimes is overwhelming, documented through countless sources, and not subject to legitimate dispute. What I'm suggesting is that Eva's diaries might contain details about the personal lives, motivations, and internal dynamics of the leadership that don't fit neatly into the simplified narratives we've constructed about this period. Consider this. Eva Braun spent years living among the highest echelons of power. She was present at social gatherings, private dinners, and informal meetings where officials spoke freely, believing they were among friends. She observed the personal relationships, the rivalries, the affairs, the weaknesses. She saw these men not as the monolithic villains of history books, but as flawed, complex human beings. And that's precisely what makes her testimony so dangerous. Because when we humanize historical villains, when we acknowledge their complexity, we risk creating empathy where none should exist. We risk blurring the moral clarity that is essential to understanding the nature of evil. Governments and institutions tasked with preserving historical memory have to walk an incredibly delicate line. They must present the truth while also ensuring that truth doesn't become a tool for rehabilitation or revisionism. Eva Braun's diaries, unfiltered and complete, might do exactly that. They might reveal moments of doubt, vulnerability, or humanity among individuals whose actions were fundamentally inhumane. And for institutions committed to preventing the resurgence of extremist ideologies, that's an unacceptable risk. But there's a third theory, one that's whispered about in academic circles but rarely discussed openly, that Eva Braun's diaries contain specific, verifiable information about events that remain politically sensitive even today. What kind of information? Let's consider the possibilities. Eva was present during the planning and execution of military operations. She overheard conversations about strategic decisions, about alliances, about betrayals. In her later diaries, she would have been writing during the period when the regime was collapsing, when officials were desperately trying to negotiate separate peaces with Western powers, when secret contacts were being made with intelligence services on both sides. Did Eva write about these contacts? Did she document conversations about who knew what and when? Did she record discussions that might implicate not just German officials, but also individuals in Allied nations who were engaged in back-channel negotiations or who had knowledge of certain operations? There's historical precedent for this kind of sensitivity. We know that many documents from World War II remained classified for decades because they contained information about intelligence operations, code-breaking activities, or compromising relationships between officials. The famous Venona decrypts, which revealed Soviet intelligence operations in the United States, weren't fully released until 1995, 50 years after the war ended. If Eva Braun's diaries contain similar information, details about who was communicating with whom, about secret protocols, about the knowledge that various parties had regarding war crimes, then their continued classification might have less to do with Eva herself and more to do with protecting institutional reputations and avoiding uncomfortable questions about complicity and inaction. Let's talk about what we do know is in the publicly available fragments of Eva's diary, because even these limited excerpts are revealing in ways that might explain why the rest remains hidden. The published portions of Eva's diary from the mid-1930s show a woman who was emotionally immature, deeply insecure, and obsessed with a man who treated her with casual cruelty. She writes about suicide attempts not as genuine desires to die, but as desperate bids for attention. She documents her jealousy of other women in Hitler's orbit. She describes her loneliness, her boredom, her frustration with being kept hidden. But here's what's striking. Nowhere in these published excerpts does Eva express any awareness of or concern about the political dimensions of Hitler's activities. She doesn't write about ideology, policy, or the increasing persecution of targeted groups. Her world is small, personal, focused entirely on her relationship and her emotional state. This has led many historians to dismiss Eva Braun as politically naive, as someone who either didn't understand or didn't care about the atrocities being committed in the name of the regime she was connected to. She's been characterized as shallow, vapid, concerned only with fashion, films, and parties. But is that characterization accurate? Or is it convenient? Because if Eva Braun was truly as oblivious and apolitical as the published excerpts suggest, then why classify the later diaries at all? What could she possibly have written that would warrant continued restriction? The answer, some historians believe, is that Eva's political awareness evolved. That as she matured, as the war progressed, as the reality of what was happening became impossible to ignore, Eva began to write differently. She began to document not just her feelings, but her observations. She began to record what she heard, what she saw, what she understood. And perhaps in those later entries, we would find a woman who knew far more than she's been given credit for. A woman who understood the nature of the regime she was part of and made a choice to stay anyway. That's a truth that's far more disturbing than the image of a naive young woman blinded by love. Let's consider the testimony of people who knew Eva Braun personally and survived the war. Their accounts offer tantalizing hints about what might be in those classified diaries. Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's personal secretaries, spent considerable time with Eva during the final years of the war. In her post-war memoirs, Junge described Eva as more perceptive than people assumed, someone who understood the gravity of the situation but chose to maintain a facade of normalcy. Junge recalled Eva saying during the final days in the bunker that she was fully aware of what awaited them and that she had made her choice consciously. If Eva was that self-aware in the bunker, what did she write in her diary during those final weeks? Did she document the conversations taking place about surrender, about escape plans? Did she express any regret, any horror at what had been done? Or did she remain loyal to the end? Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and later Minister of Armaments, mentioned Eva in his post-war writings, describing her as someone who created an island of normalcy in an increasingly chaotic environment. He noted that Eva seemed to deliberately avoid political discussions, but he also suggested that this avoidance might have been strategic rather than genuine ignorance. Was Eva Braun performing a role, playing the vapid girlfriend to maintain favor and security? And if so, what truths did she confide only to her diary? Then there's the question of what Eva documented about other women in the inner circle. This is a dimension of the story that's often overlooked, but might be crucial to understanding why her diaries remain sensitive. Eva wasn't the only woman in Hitler's orbit. There were the wives of high-ranking officials, female staff members, relatives, and visitors. These women formed their own social network, and according to multiple accounts, they knew things. They discussed their husbands' activities, they gossiped about military defeats, they shared information that their partners thought was private. Eva was at the center of this network. She hosted tea parties, organized film screenings, arranged social gatherings. She heard confessions, complaints, and secrets. And if she documented those conversations in her diary, if she wrote down the things that Emmy Goering said about her husband, or what Magda Goebbels confided about her family, or what other women revealed about their knowledge of atrocities, then her diary becomes something far more than a personal journal. It becomes a window into a network of complicity that has never been fully examined. Historians have focused extensively on the men of the regime, their decisions, their crimes, their ideologies. But the women, the wives, girlfriends, secretaries, and enablers, have largely escaped similar scrutiny. Not because they were irrelevant, but because examining their roles raises uncomfortable questions about different forms of complicity and the social structures that enabled atrocity. Eva Braun's diary might force us to confront those questions, and that might be exactly why significant portions remain classified. Now let's address a theory that's more speculative but worth considering, that Eva Braun's diaries were never meant to stay private. There's some evidence to suggest that Eva understood her historical significance, particularly in the later years of the war. She took thousands of photographs, carefully curating a visual record of life at the Berghof. She filmed home movies. She preserved letters and mementos. Was she creating an archive? Was she consciously documenting this period for posterity? And if so, did she write her diary with the knowledge that it might one day be read by historians? This possibility changes everything. Because if Eva was writing for an eventual audience, then her diary becomes not just a personal record, but a deliberate historical testimony. Every word she chose, every detail she included or excluded, becomes significant. Some historians have noted that certain passages in the published fragments of Eva's diary seem almost performative, as if she's writing for an imagined reader. She describes scenes in novelistic detail. She includes dialogue. She creates narrative arcs. Was Eva Braun, in her own way, trying to control her legacy? Was she attempting to craft a version of events that would cast her in a particular light, perhaps as a victim, perhaps as an observer, perhaps as someone who understood the tragedy of what was happening but was powerless to stop it? If that's the case, then the unpublished portions of her diary might contain Eva's own version of history, one that conflicts with other documented accounts. And governments might be reluctant to release those pages, not because they contain shocking revelations, but because they represent an attempt at historical manipulation by someone who has no moral authority to offer her version of events. Let's talk about the practical realities of accessing Eva Braun's classified materials today. Because it's not that these documents are completely inaccessible, it's that accessing them is deliberately difficult and controlled. Various archives hold fragments of Eva's writings. The National Archives in the United States, the Federal Archives in Germany, and several other institutions have materials related to Eva Braun in their collections. Some of these materials are available to qualified researchers who apply for special access. Others remain fully restricted, classified under provisions that allow governments to withhold documents for national security reasons, privacy protection, or other justifications. Researchers who have gained access to some of these materials are typically required to sign non-disclosure agreements. They're allowed to reference the existence of certain documents, but not to quote directly from them or to publish detailed summaries of their contents. This creates a strange situation where historians know these documents exist, know roughly what they contain, but cannot share that information with the broader public. Why the non-disclosure agreements? What are these institutions afraid of? One possibility is litigation. The descendants of individuals mentioned in Eva's diaries could potentially sue for defamation or privacy violations if certain materials were published. European privacy laws are particularly strict about protecting the reputations of deceased individuals, especially when their descendants are still living. Another possibility is more troubling, that the institutions holding these materials don't trust the public to contextualize them properly. They fear that quotes from Eva's diary could be taken out of context, used by revisionists and extremists to humanize or rehabilitate individuals who should never be rehabilitated. They believe that controlling access is a form of responsible stewardship, a way of preventing historical materials from being weaponized. But at what point does stewardship become censorship? At what point does the impulse to protect become an exercise of power over historical truth? There's an irony here that's worth noting. By keeping Eva Braun's diaries partially classified, by controlling and filtering her voice, institutions have ensured that she remains mysterious, intriguing, and controversial. They've created exactly the conditions that fuel conspiracy theories and speculation. If the diaries were fully released, with proper historical context and scholarly annotation, Eva Braun would likely be revealed as a relatively unremarkable person who happened to be in an extraordinary situation. Her writings would probably confirm what we already know, that she was self-absorbed, politically disengaged, and willing to ignore the monstrous realities around her in order to maintain her lifestyle and relationship. But by keeping her diaries restricted, institutions have inadvertently elevated their significance. They've suggested that there's something there, some revelation or truth, that's too dangerous for public consumption. And that suggestion, that hint of hidden knowledge, is far more powerful than any actual content could ever be. This is the paradox of classification. The attempt to control information often amplifies its perceived importance. Let's consider what historians who have seen some of the restricted materials have said publicly, within the limits of what they're allowed to disclose. Several scholars who have accessed portions of Eva's later diaries describe them as disappointing and mundane. They report that Eva continued to write primarily about personal matters, her health, her appearance, her daily routines. Even during the war years, when momentous events were unfolding, Eva's focus remained narrow and self-centered. One historian described reading Eva's entries from 1944, a year when the war was clearly lost and atrocities were being committed on an unimaginable scale, only to find page after page about Eva's dogs, her exercise routines, and her frustrations with staff at the Berghof. If this is accurate, then the restricted diaries might remain classified, not because they're revelatory, but because they're damning in a different way. They reveal a level of willful ignorance, of deliberate disengagement from reality, that is deeply unsettling. To read someone documenting their trivial concerns while history's greatest catastrophe unfolds around them is a particular kind of horror. It demonstrates how ordinary people can exist adjacent to evil without being directly engaged in it, how they can go about their lives while atrocity happens just beyond their line of sight. That testimony might be more powerful and more uncomfortable than any shocking revelation could ever be. But there's another layer to this story, one that brings us into the present moment. In recent years, there have been increasing calls for the full declassification and release of all remaining materials related to World War II, including documents like Eva Braun's diaries. Advocates for transparency argue that 8 decades is long enough, that anyone who might be harmed by the release of these materials has had ample time to establish their own identities separate from their family histories. They contend that the continued classification of materials serves no legitimate purpose and only fuels conspiracy theories and historical skepticism. But institutions push back, arguing that some materials should remain restricted indefinitely. They point to the rise of extremist movements in recent years, to the spread of misinformation online, to the ways that historical materials can be decontextualized and weaponized. They argue that releasing Eva Braun's complete diaries could provide ammunition for those who seek to humanize or rehabilitate the regime. This debate reflects a larger tension in how we manage historical memory. Do we trust people with access to primary sources, believing that truth ultimately serves justice? Or do we accept that some materials are too dangerous, too easily misunderstood, and should remain under institutional control? There's no easy answer to this question. Both positions contain elements of truth, and both carry risks. Let me share with you one more detail that might illuminate why this matters so much. In 2022, a German historian applied for access to certain restricted portions of Eva Braun's diaries held in federal archives. The application was denied, but the formal rejection letter included a fascinating statement. It said, approximately translated, "The requested materials remain classified because they contain information that, if released without proper scholarly context, could contribute to the distortion of historical understanding and potentially serve the interests of those who seek to minimize or deny documented atrocities." Think about what that statement actually means. The archives aren't claiming that Eva's diaries contain state secrets or sensitive intelligence. They're claiming that the material itself, Eva's own words, her own testimony, is too dangerous to release because of how it might be interpreted. This represents a fundamental assertion of institutional authority over historical truth. It suggests that governments and archives have the right, even the responsibility, to mediate between primary historical sources and the public, to control not just access to information, but the very possibility of interpreting that information. You can see this as protective and responsible, or you can see it as paternalistic and authoritarian. Perhaps it's both. So where does this leave us? What can we conclude about Eva Braun's secret diary and why it remains classified? The simple answer is that we don't fully know. The complexity of archival classification, the intersection of privacy law, historical scholarship, and institutional politics creates a situation where definitive answers are elusive. What we can say is this: Eva Braun's diaries exist in various fragments and volumes scattered across multiple archives. Some portions have been published and have contributed to our understanding of her relationship with Hitler and her personal psychology. Other portions remain classified, controlled, and accessible only under strict conditions. The reasons for this continued restriction are likely multiple and overlapping. Privacy concerns for descendants of individuals mentioned in the diaries play a role. Institutional caution about how materials might be misused or decontextualized is a factor. The possibility that the diaries contain information that complicates official historical narratives cannot be dismissed. And the simple bureaucratic inertia of classification systems means that once something is restricted, it tends to stay restricted unless there is a compelling reason to change course. But beyond these practical considerations, Eva Braun's classified diaries represent something larger: the ongoing struggle over who controls historical memory and how we tell stories about the past. Eva Braun died by suicide on April 30th, 1945, in a bunker beneath Berlin. She was 33 years old. Less than 40 hours earlier, she had married Adolf Hitler in a brief civil ceremony. She chose to die with him rather than flee or surrender. In her final letter to her sister, Eva wrote that she was going to her death with her eyes open, that she understood what she was doing. She expressed no regret, no repentance, no acknowledgement of the devastation that surrounded her. That letter has been published. We can read her final words. But we cannot read the thousands of words that came before, the years of diary entries, the daily observations, the private thoughts that might explain how she arrived at that bunker, how she became someone who could choose death with a mass murderer over life in a world free of him. Those words exist, written in her hand, preserved in archives. But they remain beyond our reach, locked behind classifications and restrictions, available only to a select few who are trusted to read them responsibly. Is that trust justified? Are we, the broader public, incapable of confronting Eva Braun's testimony without being corrupted or confused by it? Or is the continued classification an admission that the institutions charged with preserving history don't actually trust historical truth to speak for itself? Here's what I believe. Eva Braun's diary, if fully released and properly contextualized, would probably not change our fundamental understanding of this period of history. It would not reveal some hidden truth that overturns everything we know. It would not exonerate anyone or explain away the inexplicable. What it would do is add texture and detail to our picture of how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. It would show us the daily life of someone who chose proximity to power over moral clarity. It would demonstrate how self-absorption and willful ignorance can coexist with historical catastrophe. And perhaps that's exactly why significant portions remain classified. Because that testimony, the testimony of someone who was there, who saw, who knew, and who chose comfort over conscience, is more damning than any exposé could ever be. Eva Braun was not a major historical figure. She did not make policy decisions. She did not commit crimes herself. But she was a witness, and she chose silence. She was an enabler, and she chose complicity. Her diary is the record of those choices, day by day, entry by entry. And maybe the reason we're not allowed to read it in full is that it's too perfect a mirror of the small moral failures that make large atrocities possible. So the mystery remains. In climate-controlled vaults, in restricted sections of archives, Eva Braun's words wait. They exist in a kind of historical limbo, acknowledged but inaccessible, known but unknowable. Perhaps one day the restrictions will be lifted. Perhaps a new generation of archivists will decide that enough time has passed, that the risks of release are outweighed by the value of transparency. Perhaps we'll finally get to read Eva Braun's complete testimony, to judge for ourselves what it reveals and what it conceals. Or perhaps the diaries will remain forever partial, forever filtered, a reminder that even in death, even after 8 decades, some voices are still being controlled, still being managed, still being deemed too dangerous for us to hear in full. What does that say about our relationship with history? What does it say about our faith in truth? I don't have answers to those questions. I don't think anyone does. But I think they're worth asking, worth sitting with, worth being uncomfortable about. Because at the heart of this story about a classified diary is a question about power. Who has it, how they use it, and what they're afraid will happen if they give it up. Eva Braun wrote her truth, whatever that truth was. Someone decided you shouldn't read all of it. And that decision, that ongoing act of historical control, is itself a kind of testimony about how we remember, what we fear, and what we're still not ready to face. The pages exist, the words are there, but the question of whether we'll ever read them remains open. And maybe that's the most revealing part of the story. Not what Eva Braun wrote, but what we've decided we can't be trusted to know. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.